In recent years, we have witnessed some political and epistemological shifts in the field of language studies. Professor Ofelia Garcia, with the concept of translanguaging, has contributed a lot to deconstruct the ideas of language, teaching, and also bilingual education. So can you tell us about how your background and your experience have contributed to the development of translanguage theory?
Oh, thank you, Ruval. I start basically from a semiotic background, but at the same time a teaching background. And so I'm at the end of my career basically. So I started reading about bilingualism when bilingualism was still defined in very modernist ways, from what we have all called the monoglossic perspective. Because there weren't too many bilingual scholars in the field. It was just an emerging field then. And I, as a good student, I read a lot. I read the basics. I read Weinreich, and I read Haugen, and I studied with Fishman, with Joshua Fishman. And I read it all, but it never made too much sense to me. Because in my own experience in a bilingual community and in my own experience teaching, it never worked that way. It was a lot more fluid. Languages were not designated as first or second. They were all mine in some ways, and I thought, this doesn't really make too much sense, this idea of having a first language and a second language always separate. Because to me, that's not the way in which I used my repertoire. I was a lot fuller than just English and a lot fuller than just Spanish. And I knew that was the use that I did at home. I was the oldest of four. I was almost 11 when I arrived in New York City from Cuba. I lived in a bilingual community, but I was the oldest of four, and I had two younger siblings born in the United States. So that the family itself, their language practices in the family were just a lot more than Spanish only, and were a lot more than English only, right? And this was the same thing that happened when I went out into the community. I lived in a neighborhood that today has become very fashionable in Jackson Heights, which was then a poorer immigrant neighborhood where nobody went except basically a lot of Latino immigrants. And you have to also remember the times. It was before the immigration influx. And basically New York City was dominated by Puerto Ricans who were Spanish speakers because there was no immigration. We were still pre-1965 when the amendments to the Immigration Act were done. But I knew that in my community, everybody spoke something that we made sense of, but it wasn't just Spanish and it wasn't just English. It wasn't there when I went shopping, it wasn't there when I went to church, but it was there when I went to school, right? In school, I had the good fortune when I went to high school that I won a scholarship to a Catholic school in the Bronx. So I traveled 3 subways all the way up to the north of the Bronx to this Catholic high school, all-girls high school. And there were only a couple of Latina students there. But we always sat together at lunch. And I remember the nuns used to come around and give us what in Spanish we called cocotazos if we were speaking in Spanish. So it was like the school was an English-only space. But the rest of my world was not English only. But it wasn't Spanish only either. So I began to think that as I started going to college and then doing doctoral work and doing postdoctoral work, I began to think, okay, all of this is wonderful, but it doesn't reflect my life, my language practices, and what I was seeing in classrooms, which was not English only or Spanish only. I mean, you went into a foreign language class that was supposed to be all in Spanish, and the teacher would tell you that, oh no, I'm teaching Spanish as a foreign language, even though Spanish has never been in this country a foreign language. It has always been, it was here when the country started, it's been here forever. And so it's a community language, it's a US language, it's not a foreign language, but the thinking was that it could be taught as a foreign language. But if you went into classrooms and you saw and you heard what the teacher was doing, and you saw and read the textbooks that were being used to teach, you realize that they were not done in English, in Spanish only, that they were being done so that the students would make sense of it. So that was, I think, my first realization, sort of thinking, well, why is it that these students who are usually white, middle-class students who are taking Spanish as a foreign language are getting everything bilingually, even though they didn't tell you that it was bilingual. They would tell you it was immersion in Spanish. And the students that I teach, who are all, at that time, all Puerto Ricans, did not get the same privilege. They had to learn in English only. And that didn't make any sense to me, because I know that learning is about, learning is really about making sense, making meaning. We've talked a lot about what making meaning might mean. And it was about making meaning in the communicative sense, but it was also about making meaning of your own lives as a minoritized speaker, as an immigrant, as a racialized being in the United States. So I think all of this started sort of disrupting what I was reading. But, you know, I was still, as we all are, when we're students, we're still repeating what our teachers tell us. And I was really fortunate to have a very generous teacher. Joshua Fishman was very generous in the sense that he always told me what to read, but then he never was critical of what I was thinking, even if it was something that went against what he had told me to read. So, I mean, just to give you a very basic example, I remember that 1980, 1981, no, not 1980, but maybe 1985 or so, he had given me some things to read about diglossia, you know, and the whole idea that the only way you could have a stable bilingual community was to have a diglossic relationship where one language was used for one function and the other language was used for the other function, and unless you did that, unless there was complete separation, there would be language shift. And at the same time I had started working with the Language Policy Task Force at El Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños, which was a center for Puerto Rican studies that had been created at Hunter College. And there I had colleagues who were trailblazers, really, Pedro Pedraza, John Abdinassi, and they started looking at what was happening also in the Puerto Rican community in East Harlem, and what were the language practices, etc. And they started, for me anyway, disrupting all the diglossic arrangements, because here were some scholars who were saying, no, this might happen somewhere else. This might happen among bilinguals that are more elite, privileged bilinguals. This does not happen in the bilingual community of East Harlem. People don't just shift to English because they're using their full repertoire. Of course, I didn't use these terms, but that's exactly what they were saying. they might have been talking about code switching, but what they were saying was the fact that even though we heard in these communities a lot of what some other people might call mixture, to the speakers themselves, it was part of their repertoire, and there was no reason why to maintain Spanish and to maintain a Latino identity in New York City, you had to completely separate. So I started really interacting with these other ideas. I think ideas that took a long time to really take root. So I mean, if you look at my early work, very early work, when I was still under Fishman's influence, you would see that I myself said, well, you have to separate languages because that's what everybody said that had to happen in education. And, I was a student. I was following my teachers. But I also had the good fortune that, again, very early on, because Joshua Fishman encouraged me to, he said to me, if you really want to understand bilingual education, you cannot just look at public schools and what they're doing, because after all, these are institutions that are dominated by a national entity that has economic needs, social needs, etc. You need to look at what the rich kids are getting. So he sent me on a research project to look at bilingual programs in elite schools also. There was a lycée français at that time, that still exists, where they were doing it in French and English. There was at that time, and continues to exist, a German school in White Plains, and then there were a couple of ethnic schools. There was an Armenian school in Queens. There were a few Jewish all-day schools that were also teaching in Hebrew and some in Yiddish. There was even a Russian Orthodox school that was teaching in Russian with all kinds of issues. And so I started sort of expanding my understandings, because I was not constricted by what I was seeing in government schools. And then he also insisted that I look at in international context beyond the United States. And this has always been sort of natural to me, because in order to learn about myself and to learn about who I was, I had to find my way. No one taught me at that time. In my generation, first of all my high school friends got married and did not go to college after high school. That was it. I was the only one who went on to college. And there was no curriculum that I could think of. There was, and at that point, being Cuban was even more difficult, because there was absolutely no relations between the two countries. There was a silence, an absence of literature, an absence of any content. And much to my parents' chagrin, because they weren't too happy with me, I started also going to a cultural center, a Cuban cultural center, where I was able to read about Cuba's history, Cuba, and I did that all by myself. No one took me there. It was one of the things that, in order to find myself, I had to do this. So I had always had this interest in Latin America, just because I needed to think about who I was. I've always had a history. I think someone left their phone on. Should we stop this? It's mine. Let me just get it, and I can.
Yeah.
I am very, very sorry. I can just. Of course, it's a call that no one wants. But let me turn this off, and then I can continue. And by that time, I won't know what I'm saying. So anyway, so that was and so I also started reading about bilingual education in different international contexts, right? And at that time, Fishman was working in a book which he called The Rise and Fall of the Ethnic Revival. Because in the 1980s there was a rise of ethnic movements in the whole world, spurred by the civil rights movement in the United States, but went beyond it. So all the regional minorities of Europe started rising up. So there was a lot of turmoil that way and a lot of things that were happening. So I had opened myself up to that. And then, as always happens in life, it's someone that arrives and sort of opens up your world. So Colin Baker wrote to me one day out of thin air. Colin was a young scholar. I was a young scholar. And he said, Multilingual Matters wants me to do these books on foundations of bilingual education. You were recommended, and can I come and talk to you? So he came to New York. And I said to him right away, I'm not ready to write with you, but I'll help you, because I think it's important to have a foundational text in the subject. So I think Colin Baker was also a great influence in the way that I was thinking. And at some point, he said to me, maybe after the second edition was out, he said to me, I want you to come and see what is happening in Wales. And I want you to come and I want you to understand the work of Ken Williams, who is doing a doctorate with me. And Ken Williams was a teacher who started thinking, well, the way that we are approaching bilingual education in Wales, which is you do it all in Welsh and you do it all in English, does not build on a bilingual identity. So we have to think of how else to do it. And he started working with a pedagogy that's very simple, where what he was doing was he was asking the students to basically read in one language and write in the other, or read in one language and speak in the other. So that kind of thing. So where the input and the output were in different languages. And for the first time, I think, internationally, we started to see what officially could happen when the two languages were used in the same space. Up to then, they had always been used in different instructional spaces. So it was a matter of seeing, this is a different take on bilingual pedagogy, because it's a take that says that that in order to develop a bilingual identity, you have to legitimize the idea that both languages exist in the same space, that they're not diglossically used, that diglossia is a construction, if you think about it, it's a social construction that has legitimated a lot of the inequalities that exist. It just describes situations of inequality. One language is used for at home and the other one's used in school. Well, that's just describing an unequal situation. Is not saying anything about how to change that. So that was it for me. Once I started liberating myself from all of this that had been taught to me, I realized that we had to think differently about it. And at the same time, I started in bilingual education. I have a lot of respect for the pioneers in the field, for what they felt, for what people continue to feel, how important a language is to a minoritized group identity. So I want to protect that. Because sometimes people just throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think what is important is for people to understand that languages are not just one thing. They're not autonomous, they're not monolithic, but they're made up of many different parts. So the whole concept, being a student of Joshua Fishman, I had language maintenance, language shift sort of put in me. It was like, and again, it never made sense to me because I know that communities maintain their languages, their language practices in different kinds of ways depending on the opportunities and the affordances they have to use that language, right? So I started again shifting this idea of maintenance and stretching it. I try to talk now about language sustainability just because to me language maintenance is about keeping a language isolated from the forces that be. And one cannot do that if one is in the world. That's only in a museum that you can keep pieces like that. Otherwise, if you're using a language and language is to be used, then it's going to come in contact with its surroundings and it's going to be affected by its surrounding. So I like to think of sustainability because it's an ecological relationship, right? It depends on the affordances that you're given. And people don't just shift, people don't just give up one language and pick up the other. People maybe shift some practices, some pieces, maybe because they're not important to their ecology, to their identity, to their linguistic ecology. So all of this evolved out of experience and out of what I was seeing. That's a very long answer.
In one of our informal talks, you mentioned about the meaning-making process and in education. I remember when you mentioned that education always involves meaning-making and incompleteness. This is something that you stated a few weeks ago. And how is the process of meaning-making perceived according to the translanguage orientation?
Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah. And let me tell you something. Yeah. I had not thought about this until you pointed it out to me. So what I'm telling you today has been spurred by your questions and your thinking, because I think again we're also not autonomous beings, right? We're constantly confronted by others' ideas, others' words, others' questions.
Because this concept has been there in many other theories, but you were talking from a different perspective, right?
I think. Yes, except I want you again to understand that you were the one who pointed it out to me. So, and I think you're absolutely right that all education is about meaning making. But it's interesting that you pointed that out, that communicative language teaching is about making meaning, everything. But somehow, in the education of language minoritized students, that had not been taken into account. That we could have students who do not understand the word in classrooms and no one cares, I remember Jim Cummins always calls them the coloring kids, because one of his teachers once said, oh no, he's just a coloring kid. It means, he came, a month ago, he doesn't understand what's happening in the classroom. You just give him crayons and have them color, right? So it's always interesting to me that even though meaning making is the basis of all teaching, for some students, it was okay not for them to make meaning. As long as they were not bothering the rest of the class, it was fine if they didn't make meaning. But I mean, even the Supreme Court of the United States in Lau versus Nichols acknowledged the fact that just to be with the same teacher in the same classroom with the same textbooks, if you do not understand what's going on, that's not a meaningful education. But it took the Supreme Court to say that, because up to when I started teaching, no one cared that kids did not understand. Teachers followed a curriculum and that's it. The kids didn't understand. That was, it was sink or swim, right? So there was no idea that you had to provide meaning for the kids. So that, first of all, to make sure that we understand that even though, as you're absolutely right, meaning making is part of all learning, for language minoritized students, it was never a consideration. It was just, it's okay. But I do think that meaning making in the translanguaging sense goes beyond just surface meanings.
Mm-hmm.
I think it also has to do with making meaning of their lives as minoritized, as racialized beings, and to understand how this process has taken place and how they are in these situations and what it means for them. So I think meaning making through a translanguaging lens extends what we often think of as just making meaning, because it's not just making meaning of the words, but it's making sure that we uncover the ideologies that hide behind the text, and how those ideologies affect the text and our lives, right? So I think the meaning making through a translanguaging perspective is a lot deeper. Something that I haven't written about and we should write about.
Yeah.
Okay.
Another paper that a beautiful text that I've read, that you co-author with another student about deaf students. And I think this is one field that is very important for translanguage studies. I have, some students in Brazil that are very interested in translanguage because, bilingualisms, this traditional theory don't take it into account some, their specific context. So in this text, I'm just going to read part of some sentence that you mentioned. The text deals about the complexity of bilingual for deaf students. And the part of the title of the text is Lo que los sordos le enseñaron a los oyentes. And there is one sentence here that I want to highlight. So you mentioned the importance of inverter la posición de poder que ejercen los oyentes sobre los sordos. Mm-hmm. So in other words, you have stated that we need to understand bilingualism from the perspective of deaf students. It's a new way of thinking about this context. So the question would be, how can translanguage could help, or how can translanguage help students or help to deconstruct the traditional ideas about bilingualism for deaf students?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'm happy that you mentioned the deaf. I started really defining what translanguaging was because when I wrote Bilingual Education in the 21st Century, I was at Teachers College, and I had a research assistant who was a doctoral student of mine who was deaf, Deborah Cole. And I knew very little about the deaf. And I started giving her the first 3 chapters, I remember. And as I was handing them over to her for her to read, I thought to myself, okay, this idea of bilingualism doesn't make sense for Deborah. It really doesn't. And I didn't want to just do what we all do, which is to add a chapter about the deaf, because that's what everybody does. They sort of add a chapter. But if you put yourself in the shoes of the deaf, how is it that they understand their bilingualism? What does it add to our concepts of bilingualism, right? And of language. For example, a very traditional construct of what language is language is made up of oracy and literacy. Mm-hmm. Where is signacy, the idea that you can sign? It's nowhere, right? So, I pushed in the first 3 chapters especially, this idea that we had to also think about the deaf. So I learned a lot about bilingualism from working with Deborah and then having contact with deaf communities, because their bilingualism is a lot more complex than just 2 languages. First of all, it's bimodal, right? You have the signing too, so it's not is not just the linguistic part, but also the multimodal gestural part, which includes everything: the face, the gestures, the hands, the body. So it's a total communication, right? So that sort of opened up the what communication was for me. And then so all of their modalities, and then the idea of the complexity. For example, if you think about immigrant deaf children, they often come sometimes from countries where they have not been taught to sign, right? Sometimes with another sign language, and now they have to come to the United States, learn ASL, learn English, communicate with their parents who speak another language. So it's a lot more complex than just thinking about two languages. Their families are complex also, right? Because most deaf children have hearing parents. The schools are not serving them at all. I mean, as a matter of fact, there is now less signing in deaf education than there was 20 years ago. I mean, because the cochlear implants have produced this illusion that deaf children could really hear. When we know that cochlear implants have made the situation even more complex, because there is a continuum of hearing, as there is a continuum of language practices for all of us, or bilingualism, right? But there's definitely a very big continuum of hearing for the deaf, some who are profoundly deaf and some who with technology have been able to hear more. But what we do know is that they fail in most educational endeavors because they're not taught to sign. And again, it's something that I don't understand, because it doesn't mean one thing or the other. I mean, children can be taught to sign, and if they have successful cochlear implants with the resources that are needed in order to help them hear, because you have to do a lot of training in order for the children to make sure that they actually hear. You can also use speech if you wanted to. So it's not, I mean, this idea that things have to be done either one way or the other, when things can be done in all ways, I think that's what's important, what the deaf also gave me. The idea that you talked before about incompleteness, the idea that nothing is complete, and because we are all incomplete beings, and meaning is incomplete, and we're all incomplete beings, we have to be able to use all the resources we have at our disposal. And because we're different, not always do we have the same resources, and that's why, socially, economically, politically, linguistically, culturally, you go on and on and on, so that you have to be able to have a philosophy of education that says we have to be able to draw from whatever they have. So that to me is important, and I have learned a lot from the deaf, and especially the weak political situation that they're in. One of the things that amazes me is that there are more and more programs to teach signing to hearing people, and less programs to teach signing to deaf people. Now that's ridiculous. I mean, we have to invert that in some way. So,
one of the things that one of the assumptions of translanguaging is that students can make use of their full linguistic repertoires in the classroom. This is, very quoted in many papers and in your papers as well. So I'd like to address two contexts talking about the use of their full linguistic repertoires. The first context is, how do you see a space for translanguaging in a so-called monolingual context?
Okay. What do you mean? In a place like
In a place like Brazil, for example, or in a place like when it is that class was not designed for a bilingual class.
Right.
This is just, it is part of the curriculum.
Right. So first of all, I think that there are
because there's this belief of the monolingual, right?
Right. Yeah, that's right. Belief.
Yeah.
Belief is a good way of putting it, right? Because I think that there are probably no monolingual contexts, right? It's sometimes a monolingual context because we refuse to see or hear what else is there. You know, it sort of disappears. It makes it invisible, as De Sousa Santos says, right? So there's always a lot more heteroglossia, a lot more diversity than meets the eye. If, as I deeply believe, to have any equality of communication or what, the listening subject is as important as the speaker. It behooves all of us to make our children listen to linguistic differences with a good ear, right? So that even in contexts that are so-called monolingual, it's very, very important to help the students in the class hear accents, diversities, different speech patterns, etc. Beyond the many indigenous languages that there are in Brazil, and you know, and that are should be part of the national identity in some way, that should also be listened to. But so I think transformations only occur when
and the use of Portuguese.
And the use of Portuguese, absolutely. So, but transformations in identities only occur when listeners are also transformed, right? So, so I do think that there has to be a space for them to understand that a monolingual context is constructed by political forces and by power in ways that obscures, hides the diversity that exists and that it's there. So I think those spaces, spaces of what we might call critical multilingual awareness, even in a class that's supposed to be monolingual, is very, very important.
And then we have another space, so let's go back to the multilingual context. How can a teacher, for example, deal with students from different named languages? For instance, in the context of refugee students, that the teacher doesn't know, you know, all of those varieties and repertoires.
Yeah, I think that heterogeneity of language practices is what defines us today. It's what defines the world today. So that it is impossible for teachers to know and be familiar with all the language practices of the children in the classroom, first of all, right? And secondly, sometimes even when, you know, I always say by the time the teacher learns, I don't know, the language of the children, then another group will have come in and now the composition of the class is different. So it's impossible for teachers to be acquainted and to know or to be able to perform with all the language practices of children. But it is possible to have pedagogical practices that encourage those diverse practices, even if you don't understand what's going on. Now, to do that, you have to be a different type of teacher. You know, I always talk about being a you have to let your students be your co-teacher, right? And I have examples of teachers who have been very excited by this and who have learned a great deal by taking it up because they have learned things about other languages, the languages of the children that they would have never understood had they not opened the space to discuss it and have it. So you can't, you know, if you have, as we have in New York City sometimes, a classroom of 25 where there are 13 different languages, and this happens sometimes, You're not going to have a teacher that knows the 13 languages. You might have a peer who knows the same language, so you can pair them off. You will have a parent who knows the child's language, so you have to use that resource a lot more. You might have another teacher in the school or a paraprofessional in the school who knows the child's language, so that you can use them as resource. There are people in the community, in clubs, in associations, in temples that can provide assistance. So does it take a little bit more work? Yes, it does. However, what I have found in classrooms of teachers who take this on is that the engagement of the students is so great, and they're so alive and so grateful that the teacher is interested, that that they're happy to do it, because it makes the rest of their teaching a lot more enjoyable. So, and you don't have to do it the whole day. I think we have a video in one of our clips in the project of a teacher whose name is Andy Brown, and Andy, his classroom composition has changed, so he doesn't do today what he used to do 3 years ago, which is always interesting also, because as you know, your teaching has to adjust to the class, to the kids, so it's not the same. But 2 or 3 years ago, 4 years ago, he had 6 different languages in the classroom. He was teaching a class that was supposed to be English language arts. And what he would do every day, first of all, he took it upon himself to label things in his classroom in the different languages of the students, in the 6 languages of the students, and then also to find reading in the 6 languages. But he didn't do that all the time. But every day he used to have something in that the class did together in 2 of the languages, 2 of the 6 languages. So in his case, he would put up on the whiteboard what is called the to-do, which is what are the children going to do today, right? It's sort of the lesson objective, and that phrase was read by first the students who spoke that language, and then the rest of the class. And then he would ask, is it correct? And it never was correct, because he used to get it off Google, and Google always gets something wrong. And then the students would correct him, and he would learn. And the clip that we have has something in Spanish and then something in Arabic. The Arabic, of course, is all wrong because it's in the wrong. But the children are learning that there are different languages, different scripts, that the directionality is different, So it's not just English only, and it's not only alphabetic script, but there are other scripts and other ways of reading and writing. So I think those are very important values that children pick up, and that stay with them. So not only is it good for the teacher, because he or she engages the children more, but it's good for the whole class, not just for those who speak the language, but for the rest, again, for the listeners who are now hearing a language that they're not familiar with, so that it doesn't become, oh, what is he or she speaking, but becomes natural.
Some other future directions and other things that have emerged. We have seen different labels, such as trans, pluri, metrolingualism, for example, now in the literature of the fluidity. So these terms have been used to deal with the fluidity of linguistics and semiotic resources. And how do you see these other possibilities?
I chose trans because I chose languaging first, right? Languaging makes a lot of sense to me. And it makes a lot of sense to me because it focuses on the process of the speaker and the listener making meaning together, right? So that liberates me from language as a structure. So languaging to me is important. The trans part to me was very natural in a way, because again, I told you before when we started that I had to read about who I was on my own. And one of the things that fell into my hands very early on when I was in college was a book by a Cuban ethnologist, a Cuban anthropologist whose name was Fernando Ortiz, who wrote in the 1940s something called El Contrapunteo Cubano del Tabaco y el Azúcar, right? And it was about this counterpoint, which again, the counterpoint is a good concept for me in translanguaging, because if you think of the music by Bach, which is a counterpoint, you see that there are different notes, but you hear it only as one melody, right? So that I thought, okay, that tells me something. But in this piece, Ortiz coins the term transculturación, and he opposes it to the more North American concept, Malinowski's concept of acculturation. And he talks about the fact that possibly maybe in Brazil also, but certainly that Cuban culture was a symbiotic mix, if you want to call it, of European, African, and Indian roots. And that and he talks about the fact that Cuban culture is not one or the other. It's not 1, 2, 3, but it is something that is born differently out of this bringing together, right? And as a matter of fact, he says it's just like what happens with people. There's the child is never the same as the parents. It's something else, right? And so to me, that's also translanguaging. The fact that when these languages come together in an individual, you can't compare it to what the parents were or what was happening in the monolingual context. It's something different, and it has to be accepted. That's why the whole concept of incomplete acquisition about bilinguals never makes sense to me, because that's always a comparison to the parents, to what happened in the old country, and that doesn't make any sense. So that's the trans for me was perfect. And then came Colin Baker when he translated the Ken Williams term in Welsh, and that also had the trans. So I like the trans because it tells me something, it connects me to other ideas that I have had. And it's also about a beyond, right? A beyond language, right? I would think, well, trans is about beyond named languages, beyond named cultures, which I think the pluri doesn't really have because it's just many. Yeah. Whereas a trans is beyond. And the metro is, I think the metro originally was coined for metropolitan urban use, which I think, again, translanguaging goes beyond. So to me, translanguaging is more useful because of what it connotes, the beyond, but also because I'm interested in education. That is the context where I think most inequality happens, and therefore the one that we really have to change. Translanguaging as a term, originally in Welsh, was coined in an educational context. So it says more to me also.
Okay, and then let's move to language and education. That is the few words that you mentioned. Some of your papers, you mentioned that you have stated elsewhere that translanguage can imply resistance. It has to do with the decoloniality of language, and can also be seen as a political act, right? Yeah. So could you expand on this idea?
Yeah, I think that if we lose those aspects of translanguaging, we are we're not doing too much, right? And I think, for example, one of the things that has happened as we have acknowledged all the fluidity, which I think increasingly scholars are acknowledging it, is that sometimes people talk about plurilingualism as if it was translanguaging. Now, I think we have to make some differentiation, right? I mean, plurilingualism, I thought, gee, the Europeans have it right on when I first started thinking about it or read about it, because the Council of Europe was now, for the first time, the way that I was seeing it, was advocating for a multilingualism that did not just consist of complete boxes, but that people used these different languages to the extent that they needed, when they needed it, where they needed it. And that to me was a big advance. But plurilingualism was coined by the Council of Europe to develop a European identity, right? A European identity that went beyond the national identities. I think it was a great move, but it's not the same as translanguaging, right? Because it was coined by a supranational body, whereas translanguages was coined by an educator from, you know, I always say in the borderlands, right? I mean, in Wales, in the middle of the UK, right? Here it is. So it was from the bottom, not from the top. And it was not to create just a European identity, but it was all the opposite. It was to sustain a minoritized identity, right? So I think that there are differences. Now, you know, plurilingualism gives a sense of the fluidity, but to me it doesn't capture the political nature of translanguaging that I think exists in the beginning. And I think unless we are careful, then it just becomes any type of fluid practices, right? So I worry about it, and I think that, you know, it was Nelson Flores that had in a blog saying, you know, translanguaging is a political act, and I think he's right that we have to make sure that it continues to mean that for minoritized populations. Now, I know that many Europeans, as you are, you know, the term plurilingualism has extended from its origins and is now being used many, many times for the teaching of refugees, asylum seekers in Europe. And I have no objections to that. I just think that that we have to, when we use the term translanguaging, we want to make sure that it's more than just fluidity of languages, that it also has a social meaning, a transformative meaning, that leads to maybe more social justice, more equality in educational, pedagogical practices, curriculum, programs, structures, policies, etc.
And I'd like to move to the last point of our talk. So this is one specific topic that I have interest in, that is about teacher education. For example, with my colleague Claudia Hilsdorfer from Brazil and some other colleagues there, we have published and supervised some thesis and dissertation about issues of critical education, social justice, and you know, how do you see, what are the implications for a critical teacher education, take into account the translanguaging perspective?
I think that's something that you have already begun to think about, because I just read your paper in which you talk about what critical means in a way that expands the North American uses of critical, and I liked it very, very much. So I think it's a matter of, and the Brazilians know this well. So it's a matter of making sure that there's a conscientização of the teachers, of their role, and the impact that educational systems have had in promoting inequality, and especially the impact that language, that our concepts of language have had in promoting inequality, and assessments, and the way that students are assessed, and texts, and the way that they're produced. So I think all of this is more important than the teachers, than any type of pedagogy that is linear in any kind
Based
of
on
way.
training.
So education, that's why I like to talk. I never talk about training of teachers, but education of teachers, because it's a lot more broad. I know it's not what teachers sometimes want. Teachers sometimes want a recipe of what to do in the classroom. I always think that when we theorize, we can't leave the children and the teachers behind. So we have to also be able to speak to them. And sometimes I negotiate my positions depending on the structure that I'm faced with. For example, you walk into a school and you see that they have a bilingual program that strictly separates, and they really believe in strictly separating. So one of the things that we've done in the project, which I think has been very smart, is last year we thought, well, how do we then, why don't we just focus on developing bilingual readers? And to develop bilingual readers, you can't have that strict separation, because the students have to talk, have to be critical of what they're reading, and that they have to do through their full repertoire, through whatever repertoire they have. So that's how you open up the space. Or this year, Ivana Espinet and Maite Sanchez and Gladys Aponte are working on opening up an inquiry space, a social studies inquiry space, which is something that had existed, but that now could be shaped to help teachers and students think of the many aspects of translanguaging in their community. So I think that when we work in education and when we educate teachers, we have to make them aware of what exists, right? So because they're going to have to go out there and work in those programs, with those policies, with those texts, with the way that with those pedagogical practices. But I think what the most important thing is to make them aware of why those policies have been put into place, and what they can do. And all good teachers know how to do this, to be negotiators of that policy to benefit the students, right? In the book that I edited with Kate Mencken, we called it Teachers as Policymakers, because you can't just be a soldier. And I think that is part of what teacher education has to inculcate in these teachers. They're not just soldiers following orders. They have to be able to take the policy and adapt it to their context in ways that liberates, in the way that you have so well spoken about, those students from the constraints that the policies have been, in the ways in which the policies have been implemented. So I think that's what makes it critical.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
That was a very inspiring talk.
Good. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you, and thank you especially for all you have taught me these few months.
Thank you.
Okay.